So welcome to the exclusive F1 FanVoice interview with Sir Jackie Stewart. Thank you very much this morning for your time. We had an amazing response. We had over 3,500 questions that people wanted to put to you. Unfortunately, we only have an hour, so we're going to run through around 15 to 20 questions with you. I'll let you know who the questions are from, and our fans will be fascinated to know how you respond. So the first question we had was from Hayden in Australia. Hayden wanted to know, what made you want to race in F1 in the first place?
I think every young racing driver's ambition is to get to Formula One. I didn't really think I was going to go very far in motorsport because I was trap shooting for Scotland and Great Britain before I went to drive racing cars. And it was accidental that I got a start. And once you start locally in Scotland, Charterhall was the racetrack there, and a little sprint at Heathfield. After I got up to going down to Goodwood and Silverstone and Snetterton and Oulton Park, etc., suddenly you get the mood for the bigger picture. And when I got into Formula 3, then the obvious thing from there was to see if I was good enough to get as far as Formula 1. It kind of happened as an accident almost, and that's the wrong word to use in racing, but certainly in my time. But it wasn't something I set my mind in ever being a racing driver. I thought I was going to be a clay target shooter and working in a garage, basically. So it's all come as a bit of a surprise in a funny sort of way.
Jeff Taylor from Australia, he would like to know, who was your racing hero when you were younger?
My ultimate hero was Juan Manuel Fangio, the great five-time world champion. His dignity, his style, his driving skills, everything was so easy and it looked like it was all in slow motion. He was a gentleman. He carried himself in a very classical fashion. And when he did come out of motor racing, he carried on being, in fact, president of Mercedes-Benz Argentina, for example, as he was Argentinian. And he carried the dignity and style, I think, that Formula One is somewhat lacking today, but was a very good foundation to how motor racing is developed. But Jim Clark was the best racing driver I ever raced against, and for that he was my hero, but my friend. We shared an apartment together, we were both Scots, we spent an awful lot of time together, and he, in my period as a driver, he was the ultimate from my point of view. But Fangio, in the overall picture, I think was the model, I think, for all of us, and it should have been, because of how he carried himself as well as how he raced.
Manuel from the US wants to know, what is your funniest racing memory?
I can't imagine what my funniest thing in motor racing was. Maybe Ken Tyrrell dropping my Rolex watch because before I got into a car in a Formula One race for 10 till, the last thing I did was take the watch off and hand it to Ken. He dropped it. And I knew it there and then, I heard it. And the crystal was definitely broken. And of course, it was the beginning of a race, so we didn't really want to, this is on the grid, didn't really want to have a conversation about it. But it was, I think, his most embarrassing moment and my sort of, pardon the French, but oh shit moment. It wasn't a laugh, it was, and then I had to start thinking outside the Rolex.
So the next question is a bit closer to home, from Jack Spencerley in the UK. He wants to know, what was your favourite F1 car to drive during your career?
I don't think there's any doubt that the Matra MS80, which I won the World Championship with in '69, I think we won 6 Grand Prix that year. And 6 Grand Prix in those days, there was only 11 or 10 or something. There was never that many races. It was longer wheelbase than the Tyrrell turned out to be. You could use the car more I suppose you could take it to a higher level comfortably. And of course, the BRM that I first drove in Formula One in 1965, my first year in Formula One, was a beautiful little car, 1500 cc. It was an easy transition from Formula 3 at 1000 cc's to 1500 cc. Of course, a much more developed engine and sophisticated engine. But the car was beautiful to look at, and it drove well, never as good as a Lotus. It never clung to the road as good as a Lotus, but it was just a prettier car and a nicer car. But to drive, no question, the Matra Ford, it was just a great combination.
Sebastian Greiner in Germany, he wants to know about, actually talk about your dyslexia, and in what way did it impact your racing career?
I'm an extreme dyslexic. I mean, I can't to this day read or write properly. Dyslexia is a really bad thing that more people have than most people recognise. But the upside is that you're more creative. You can't think like the clever folk. So you think out the box all the time, and therefore you're thinking in ways that they are not thinking. So, for example, I think my way of succeeding in motor racing came from my shooting, because I was such a disaster at school, leaving school at 15 years of age with no education at all, to suddenly finding my shooting that I suddenly got good at. I won my first ever competition that I entered, but it was a New Year Day in Scotland when everybody else was, and I wasn't. The dyslexia thing, when you're dyslexic and you find you're good at something, it doesn't matter whether it's cleaning windows or cleaning floors, you can do that better than the so-called clever folk. And I found my attention to detail thing was my biggest asset. And therefore, driving for whatever reason, which is contradictory, by the way, because if I can't read or write or say the Lord's Prayer or sing the national anthem, how can I think of being quite good at something else? It's a very contradictory, it's an illness almost. So I learned how to do things my way, but what it did do was you're so hungry to do something well that you put more into it because you're not good at very many things. So you suddenly find shooting in my world, first of all, to get to shoot for Britain and Scotland, of course, but then to get into Grand Prix racing and do well in that. Whew, I'm not the failure that I thought I was going to be and that the school had taught me to think I was. So it's a very painful thing. I think about 15% of the population are dyslexic now. More men than women, funnily enough, or boys than girls. But in a funny sort of way, it's helped me. I mean, people like Steven Spielberg's dyslexic. George Lucas, who would else have thought of Star Wars than somebody dyslexic? Einstein was dyslexic. Leonardo da Vinci was dyslexic. Branson, the Visionaire man's dyslexic. Just so many different people. Churchill was one of the greatest orators, was dyslexic. So the folk who have dyslexia shouldn't be embarrassed by it. They should find something that they can do well. I'm very good at cleaning windows and very good at floors because I don't want to see a speck on the floor or the window. Now, the clever folk would say, that doesn't matter, somebody else will do that. As a dyslexic, you want to do it. So I think it helped me to be so focused, and therefore the preparation of the cars, the attention to the detail, I'm sure it had a lot to do with what came. So
my next question is from Bhavesh Bhatia from India, who would like to know, what would you say was the most challenging race of your career?
I think any Grand Prix racing driver, certainly of my period, and it doesn't exist today because it doesn't air anymore, but the Nürburgring in Germany, 14.7 miles, 172 corners per lap. In the early days, we were taking off sometimes more than 10 times a lap, sometimes 13 times a lap. And a Formula One car was never designed to fly. And you could get off the ground very easily. Getting back down, the balance was never right. So you were coming down in one wheel or two wheels, and it was a drama. To do the Nürburgring really quickly and get, you never got every corner right or every exit right. But I think I won 4 times in the Nürburgring. Once in Formula 2, when I got there's a ring that they give you, the Eiffel King or something. And I got it from Formula 2 before I had driven Formula 1. So that would be the biggest challenge. And I don't think there's ever been a racetrack in the world, or will there ever be a racetrack in the world to join up in that. And I won one of my best races ever at the Nürburgring. It was sometimes snowing, it was certainly fog and spray and heavy rain. I think I won by 4.2 minutes. Very contradictory. With 187 corners per lap, how could a dyslexic remember every corner? So it's very strange that I could do that, but it's visual and it's tactical. So it somehow or other removed the dyslexic disablement, which it is. And for some reason, I wasn't bothered with it in a racing car. Which
of your contemporary drivers would you consider to be your toughest opponent? And this is from Andy Allen in the US.
Well, I think during my window in Formula One, there was probably more top drivers than there's been in any era, I think. Because if you think of the Jim Clarks, the Jack Brabhams, the Graham Hills, the Denny Holmes, the Francois Severs, the Emerson Fittipaldis, the Mario Andretti's, and apologies for those who I haven't included. But you think of them, extraordinary skills. There was, at that time, usually about 8 really good drivers who I think could have won in almost any circumstance. They were there because they drove very well in the formative classes of the sport and were picked up in a way that somehow or other doesn't seem to happen today, because the cost of getting to be considered in Formula One is so high with the cost of motor racing today, which is a pity, because there's a lot of people don't get there that could obviously get there. In my period, I don't think there was many who didn't get there, because if they were very good, that is. For some reason, it didn't happen like that. Peter Gethin came up and won the Italian Grand Prix, for example, and wasn't considered one of the great drivers of the world. But the Jim Clarks, and he had Mike Spence driving for him at one point, and Arundel driving for him, both top racing drivers. And I was driving as a second driver to Graham Hill to begin with, and so was Denny Holm to Jack Brabham. And Fittipaldi and Andretti came in almost out of the blue in a way. So, the times after that, there were still a lot of good drivers, but I think during that period, it was the halcyon period of Formula One particularly. So, big privilege to be asked to drive, and to be amongst that group was fantastic. And of course, we all drove sports cars, GT cars, Car-Am cars, Indy cars, touring cars at that time, as well as Formula One. So the versatility of the driver was more than I think exists today.
And in terms of safety, you're very much an advocate for safety. How do you view safety today, and which areas needs to be addressed? And that question's from Dennis Elliott in the US.
The safety thing was, at that time, the greatest challenge I've ever had. I mean, we were losing so many drivers and nothing was being done. the cars themselves were overly fragile, some more than others. The Lotus, for example, was particularly fragile, and an awful lot of people died in Lotuses. I drove for BRM, who were very solid, and so was Ken Tyrrell with Matra and the Tyrrell Ford. But the danger was so obvious that things had to change, and yet it wasn't happening. The largest issue was the racetracks themselves. There was no runoff areas, there's no gravel traps, there was no deformable structures. There was trees, there was drop-offs, there was, and we moved from a 1500cc car, a 1.5 litre car, immediately to a 3 litre car, 3000cc. And the difference in speed of entry to a corner, braking distances, was so different. The racetracks were never able to handle that, because the racetracks, in many cases, were the same racetracks as before World War II. And the Nürburgring was an example, Spa-Francorchamps was an example. Silverstone was a disused airfield of World War II, but it was a really fast racetrack. And even then they didn't have runoff areas. Woodcock Corner, where you drove in a Formula One car 153 miles an hour through it in a drift. But if you went off the road, there was only less than the length of this room. So you almost always went into sleepers. Railway sleepers was what they had to keep the dirt upwards and therefore not get to the spectators. So the cars were fragile and the racing tracks were too dangerous. So I started it and became the president of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, GPDA. And we had a lot of power, but everybody was very sensitive about losing their drive in case they were pressured into not driving in a race. That was always a nervous issue for, let's say, not the top drivers. The top drivers were more open towards it. But it had to be done. Helen and I counted 57 friends who died in motor racing. A lot of them Formula One drivers, but clearly not all of them. And these were people that stayed with us, travelled with us, holidayed with us. I mean, really close friends. And that was ridiculous. The swinging 60s and the 70s were hideously dangerous. I said, you know, motor racing was dangerous and sex was safe. I had a large part to play in changing the motor racing safety, and some of you guys are responsible for the other. So it was a glamorous, colourful and exciting period, but it was a dangerous period. To lose the Jim Clark. When Jim Clark died, I think it woke everybody up. It woke everybody up, because if Jim Clark got killed, how could you, because he drove so cleanly and so never off the road. But then, you know, he died on the 7th of April, 1966. Mike Spence died in the same weekend. The next month, Ludovico Scarfiofi did, and the same weekend of the next month. The 4th month, Joe Slesser died in the French Grand Prix. And later, Piers Courage died in fire, as did Schlesser. No fire extinguishers, not anything that would put a fire out. No marshals, they weren't properly dressed to go into a fire. The medical facilities were poor. Everything was wrong, and the races never stopped. I mean, when Piers Courage died, Jochen and I were racing together, and Jochen and I were both very good friends of Piers, and we knew it was Piers that had died. And we were driving through the flames, and the race was never stopped. And when Joe Slesser died, again, we were driving through the flames. It was a magnesium car, a Honda car. It was melting, and the fuel had already exploded, and it was running across the track with the camber of the circuit. And we were driving through it. And sometimes in 1968, Jackie X won the race. I think I was second. I nearly hit an ambulance in the spray. There was another car with spray in front, and he had moved out, and the ambulance was right there in front of me. I mean, things like that don't happen today, and rightly so. So you could say it was glamorous, colourful and exciting, but it was hideously tearful. Going to the funerals, Jim Clark's funeral, Big Dan Gurney in tears, all of us affected by the parents, the children, the brothers and the sisters and sons and daughters in some cases. And nobody was doing anything about it. So it had to change. Very unpopular change. When I closed the Nürburgring, there was a GPDA meeting coming straight out of the memorial service of Bruce McLaren. And it was in the Dorchester Hotel. And I pointed out that we couldn't, at that time we had started to do track inspections. So a Grand Prix driver would go and inspect each trap. I did Harama the day that Jim Clark died, and was doing it when I was told. Jochen was sent to the Nürburgring because he was speaking German, and they wouldn't change one thing. They wouldn't do one single thing. And we had this meeting, and it was an emotional meeting with Bruce's memorial service and the reality of the fatality rate. And the drivers were saying, well, we might lose our drives if we say no. And Jack Brabham got the balance of yes or no, because I was going to resign from the GPDA if they didn't agree. And Jack Brabham stood up and said, we've got to go with Jackie, because we can't continue like this. And we closed the ring. I had death threats because the Eifel region was almost dependent economically on tourism. And the Nürburgring, in those days we had 375,000 people at the Nürburgring, 14.7 miles on both sides of the racetrack. So it was a huge event for 3-4 days. They would camp out. And we were just, it was ridiculous. But it changed. And now we have, this is safer than rugby. It's safer than equestrian for sure. And we have cars and apparel, and we've got firefighters, and we've got medical centres. Today, motor racing is an example to the world of how to get things done, even at the enormous. Look at the Alonso accident in Australia. Look at Mark Webber's accident when he end over ended up in the air nearly as high as these girders here, if you like. So it's a changed world.
I've got a question from the Cayman Islands, from Tim Frawley. He wants to know, do you think F1 will ever be replaced by Formula E, or by electric cars at least?
I think that Formula One is very secure for a really long time. Formula E is a good thing to demonstrate that energy can be used in a positive way, and even in racing. But the cars are doing only about 130 mile an hour. There is no sound. The racetracks themselves are in places that are not built for racing, sometimes in the back of a container ship area or whatever else. And I think there's a novelty factor of it just now, and not that many people can be accommodated. But environmentally, it's a good thing to be doing, and the major car makers are getting involved in it because they're producing engines that are going to give alternative fuels and energies. So I think it's a good gymnasium for that. Somehow or other, Formula One, I don't think will ever be overtaken, but we will change our technology progressively. Even now, we're using less fuel and oil than we've ever used. We in a whole season, a Grand Prix, we use less fuel considerably than one 747 crossing the Atlantic. So we're not doing a bad job, and we're not using a lot of fuel today that we were before. But and we're making better lubricants than we've ever made before, because motor racing accelerates that knowledge. So I don't think it's a conflict. I think it's complementary in a way to each other. But Formula One is still globally one of the greatest events of any calendar year because there's only one Grand Prix in each country around the world. So I think for the foreseeable future, it's going to stay that way.
This question is from Kudimya Somayaji from India. He'd like to know, do you think the idea of a budget cap is the right way in terms of levelling the grid for the sport at the moment?
A budget cut would unquestionably, I think, help, because the cost of Formula One is going up to a level which many people just simply can't afford. But Formula One's ingenious about getting round regulations, and how you actually achieve it is a different thing. Max Mosley tried to do it when he was president of the FIA, the Federation International Automobile. And I'm not sure that it worked. It might have worked for a short time, but Formula One's more creative in getting under fences than any other activity I can think of. But I think it's got out of control now. And I think the big teams are spending such a lot of money that it's very difficult for anybody else to get in there. Somehow or other, we're going to have some kind of regulations. But of course, the general public think they just want to see the absolute ability of the motor car, the engine, whatever it is, aerodynamics that make us go faster. But the cost of Mercedes-Benz at the present time, for example, are probably spending more money than anybody else, maybe in the history of the sport. Whereas Ferrari used to be spending more money than everybody else, and Red Bull, when they were winning 4 world championships back-to-back, were obviously spending money. And therefore, the lesser teams and the newer teams weren't quite getting there. But, you know, Stewart Grand Prix, with a really quite small budget, managed to win a Grand Prix, managed to get a pole position, managed to get a fastest lap. And I think the highest amount of money we ever got to, which is still a huge amount of money, which I think was 28 million for a year. And I withdrew from Formula One because I didn't think I at that time could match the resources of Williams and McLaren and Ferrari. And I didn't want to be an also run. So it's a very difficult balance, but you know, Force India, for example, with a relatively small budget in comparison to the other big boys, has been doing very well in collecting World Championship points. But now they've got new ownership, and they, I think, lose all of their points. So how are they going to finance that? And we want more teams in, because 20 drivers, there's only 20 drivers in the whole world. I mean, that's of the motorised community. Our colleague in Italy, in India, who's asking this question, there's more people with a driving licence in India than the combined total of the United States and Canada. So we're going to get maybe, hopefully, some Indian drivers, but that can't happen unless it's affordable. So there is a need for it, but there's also a hugely competitive culture in Formula One, and they're very good at ducking underneath fences of finding different but sometimes very expensive ways of doing it. For example, most of your viewers won't know the sophistication of the simulators that the top teams have, how much space that takes in a building, what it costs. I mean, they're probably more advanced than the Boeing simulator, because there's so many different movements and activities in a racing car than there is in the takeoff and landing of an aircraft. But that costs huge money. Now, who can afford that? Only the very rich teams. So maybe we've got to find other ways of doing it, but we've still got to keep Formula One as the ultimate sport, formula in sport.
This leads on quite nicely to your next question, which is from Martin DSN from Holland. He would like to know, did you like more the time when you were a driver or a team principal?
Being a team principal was the toughest time I've ever had in motorsport. To find the sponsors, because I wasn't taking anybody else's sponsors. I was having to start from, from a level of Paul Stewart Racing, and we had lots of nice sponsors in Paul Stewart Racing, but none of them, or few of them, were big enough to go into Formula One because the budgets were so much larger. So we had to go out and find new ways of doing business in that. It was the most difficult time of my life. I think it took more out of me than it ever did as a racing driver. We had more to lose and bigger to challenge. I'm glad we did it, and I'm glad we came out of it at the right time. Financially, it was rewarding, but I don't know if, as an independent as we were, we would have been able to get up to the highest levels. And frankly, I had taken quite a lot out of myself driving racing cars. But Paul Stewart Racing was a very big success because Paul came, of course, with me to Stewart Grand Prix, and I was the chairman and CEO, and Paul was the head of all operations. We had quality people. It was great. We were very proud of what we achieved, but it was with relief that we sold the company.
And which up-and-coming driver are you most keeping your eye on at the moment? That's from Ashley in California.
Pass. I really don't know enough. I don't go to all the races now, so and there's no testing now. So I would have normally gone to see a young driver or a new driver having a go and just seeing how, and walk around the circuit and see them. I did all of that. Now I don't get to do it because I'm busy working with Heineken and Rolex, and my time is taken up. So I don't know the up-and-comings as I used to. I mean, because when we had a racing team, we were looking at the Carters and looking at, obviously, Formula 3, Formula 2, etc. So rather than be wrong, I would rather pass. But it's tougher today than it's ever been for a young driver to come along, to find the resources to get. The cost of Formula 3 today is huge to do the European Championship. Then to go into Formula 2, and then Formula 2 being at several Grand Prix support events, that is a challenge. And I think we have to find a way that we need young drivers, we need new blood. And they're out there, and suddenly a Verstappen arrives and blows the place apart. And that's rejuvenating a way for Formula One, that he's come in and done so well so quickly. But Red Bull had to do with that a lot by bringing him on through the formative classes of the sport. So if more multinational corporations were to take an interest, because everybody drives a car, whether it's a Fiat or a Ferrari, they're all driving cars. So some of the commercial enterprises of the world should see that and use motorsport as a way of developing their own skills within their own companies, because it's infectious, and bring young drivers along and hopefully bring them to the highest levels. But it's a big challenge.
Is there a driver that you think is similar to yourself, has a similar style? And that's from Diego Lazzari from Italy.
I modelled myself against a combination of three people. Juan Manuel Fangio, because I thought he had dignity in his style and he dressed correctly, in my opinion, for that time. Jim Clark, because of the smoothness of driving, his modesty and his manners. Graham Hill, because I learned to behave correctly. I learned to dress correctly. I learned, because Sir Alfred owned BRM, and John Coombs was there for Formula 2, and Ken Tyrrell was there in the formative classes. And I learned from all of them. I think it's a conglomeration of circumstances and people, and also the Ford Motor Company, who I was with for 40 years. Walter Hayes was the best PR man in the world, I think. And he not only did Britain and then Europe and then America and then the world in that role. I was learning from all of those people. And to have that privilege and then to see the reality of having to exercise it, having to be able to service multinationals in the right way. So I raced in an era that there was communication, much more than today, within the driver community. Because today they've all got their very fancy motorhomes, as I call them. They're more than motorhomes, they're structures and buildings for the European Grand Prix. And the facilities, they're more people isolated than there were in my time. We were more a community. We travelled together, we ate together, we holidayed together, etc. So therefore, that was all the development of a driver like myself, looking at people, how elegant Joe Bonnier was, for example. And today, Lewis Hamilton's doing a good job because he's being used in commercials for Mercedes-Benz, naturally, or the Malaysian fuel company, Petronas, and now with his clothing line that he's had, that he's done a creation with. So he's opening the sport out a little bit like I did, actually, when I came in because commercially I got in very early with big multinational corporations, and they used me a lot. I was doing television commercials around the world. I was doing American television, I was doing the Can-Am series, so I was doing TV shows. And for ABC's World of Sports, I was doing 25 events a year for a big audience, because Wide World of Sports and ABC were by far the biggest sports network in the world at that time. So I burned out, though, because I travelled the Atlantic. I travelled across the Atlantic one year, 1971. I travelled 86 times across the Atlantic. I got mononucleosis, drained my body. The next year I had duodenal ulcer that's hemorrhaged. The drivers today only do Formula One, only 20 or 21 races a year, very little testing. So they have a lot of time to be commercial. And they're well-presented young people. So they could be doing more than they're doing, in my opinion, commercially, because it's all out there, and it's, of course, they get paid a lot more money than we did. We had to race in different formulas of the sport in order to make a decent living. And for my period, maybe I was earning more than most people in the sport. But that was because I was doing what I was doing TV commercials as well as TV shows. So I think the commercial ramifications of it, Formula One is the best platform of any sport that I know for a young driver to recognise he has to present himself well, he has to speak well. In Paul Stewart Racing, we send all our guys to public speaking courses and we dress them. Because if I was getting sponsors, and we brought all our sponsors to meetings, that we would tell them what we're doing, and all of these people would arrive, and they were business people. Our guys would come out because they had good physiques, because they were going to the gym, properly dressed, and were able to speak. So you've got to do those things before you can start really attracting the attention of a multinational to have you used as much as I was. And now I see Lewis with a men's cosmetics side as well as the clothing line. And yet I don't see the other drivers, because they're making so much money out of Formula One, they don't think they need it. They need it. And it projects them too.
My next question is from Hilton from South Africa, who would like to know, do you think racing comes down too much to the car rather than the drivers? And should all cars be exactly the same with the best driver winning, not the best car?
Well, Hilton, I love South Africa. We had great times there, and I won your Grand Prix up in Kailami from time to time, and stayed in a nice hotel right at the bottom of the valley there. It was a great time. But your dream question, or whatever it may be, unfortunately is undoable. You'll never get equivalent tyres, cars, fuel, electronics to be the same. They did have a series in America where they thought they would get all of the cars identical, and the International Race of Champions it was, and I did a lot of that with television, and they were supposed to be all the same, and usually they were, but every now and again one would get a wee bit better than the other. But in Formula One we can't have that, because we've got to have competition technology wise. And one of the great things about Formula One is the progress. Somebody started to use composite carbon fibre while everybody else was using aluminium or other materials. So they break through, and that's one of the great things about Formula One, and the power that we have, the fuels that we use, because now we're using less fuel than we did then. We're using less oil than we did then. There's all sorts of new technologies have come through the competitiveness of Formula One. So we don't want to lose that. But it would be nice if we could have, I think we need budgets that would allow more testing and a whole lot of different things that would make it more appealing and more get-atable maybe. The big budgets are the problem. So maybe trying to do a budget cut or equalising the investment within Formula One would help it. But I don't think you'll ever get to a point where all the cars will be identical.
So I have a great question here from a fellow Scot, David Berman. He would like to know, he says, Scotland has some great F1 racing drivers like yourself and Jim Clark. Do you think Scotland should have its own F1 racing circuit and race?
I tried to get it at Formula One track in Edinburgh, actually, just on the edge of Edinburgh Airport, but the local authorities turned it down. They thought it was not right. It was a greenbelt area at the time, but since then, of course, it's been built up. We could have had a Grand Prix circuit there because of the heritage. Innis Ireland was the first Scot to win a World Championship Grand Prix. Jim Clark went on to win them, as I did, and we've had, Dario Franchitti winning lots of Indianapolises, and we've had touring car champions, we've had rally champions, the world champion in rallying. So Scotland, as a wee country, has delivered more motor racing talent, I think, than any country in the world. Brazil for a while, huge Brazil. I mean, I'm going to Brazil for the Grand Prix, and I think there's 26 million people in Brazil. There's 5 million in Scotland. So how can we compete with that? But the canny Scot is generally somebody who does quite well. And whether they're in business and engineering and shipbuilding and all the other things in the world, that accountants and lawyers from Scotland have been successful as they have been in motor racing. For a wee country, you try harder. I felt inferior when I went down south to begin with. Everybody was better dressed than me. They had faster and fancier cars. We're very modest in Scotland about spending money. We get blamed for it being tight, and we are. But at the same time, we're a very determined race. Most of the police forces are loaded with Scotsmen, and most of the armed forces have got a lot of Scots because they leave the country and come down. Our greatest export is people, not whiskey like most people think. So therefore, the Scot, the small country, and Paul Stewart Racing had, most of our sponsors were all from Scotland to develop young Scots, like Dario, like Alan McNish, like Dunbrake, like Franchitti, all Scots, and they were supported by Walker Shortbread and Anchor Scotland at the time, and a whole lot of very nice Scottish company, Highland Spring. So it can be done, but I think Scotland's been unique about developing talent, whether it's sports or business. So, on the other hand, currently a bigger country like Brazil is short of talent. And I think Brazil, if they got all their big companies together and all the rich folk together, they could do it again. But, you know, here was Germany for many years, there was never a Grand Prix driver. And France, there was never a Grand Prix driver until Elf Aquitaine suddenly developed all these drivers. And what was it, Montreal Canadian Grand Prix, there was 7, can you imagine 7 Grand Prix drivers only from France? Crazy. So it can be done. So just get to some of these rich folk in Scotland with big businesses and let's try and have another Scottish world champion.
Maybe one day, maybe one day. How has F1 team strategy changed from your racing career compared to now? And that's from Rick from the US. Strategy
today is an art and almost an industry of its own. Ken Tyrrell's strategy. The only time I remember real strategy with Ken Tyrrell was the Italian Grand Prix in 1969 when I was driving the Matra. And I could have won the World Championship in that particular race, which would have been nice and early. And we strategized the only thing we could do, because everybody was running the Ford engine, the Cosworth engine was the best engine in the world at that time. And apart from Ferrari and the odd different engine, all the competitors were going to be riding together in a Ford Cosworth engine. And where were we going to, at Monza, because of the slipstreaming and the drafting, it was going to be difficult. And we knew that. So the strategy was that we found out that if I put the right ratios in the gearbox, I could continue with one gear out of Parabolica, change, and then not change again as I crossed the line. And the winning margin was the smallest ever in the history of motorsport at that time, and it was that much. It was something like 3 inches, maybe less than 3 inches, between Jochen and I. And it was because I had an engine that was going to rev to a certain number and a gear shift that would take us that. And if we had the gear shift that would just take us that extra meter or two, and if I had missed the gear shift, I would have lost the race. So that was strategy, and it worked, because I won the World Championship by winning the race at Monza. Today, the tyre issue of choosing the tyre you qualify on to be in the front row of the grid. In my day, it wasn't important. To be honest with you, I think I only had about 17 pole positions. It simply wasn't something that was important. I was always up front somewhere, but never always in the front, because it didn't matter in those days. The races were longer, and the tyres, you were only using the same set of tyres for the whole race. So how you worked your race strategy was not through strategies we know it today. It was through being able to carry the right amount of fuel to finish the race, because there was no fuel stops then either, with a set of tyres that would last the whole distance of the race, and how you drove that car or how hard you had to try. So the only other strategy I can remember was at Monza. There was a race where we got paid extra money on specific laps, and Ken Tyrrell was a diamond for making money. And I won every single one. And he would tell me what lap I was going into in order to do it. So that was strategy. But nothing like exists today. I mean, today it's an art. There are strategists who are giving that information to the team principal, who has to approve it to make it happen. And it's that in itself. And keep in mind, by the way, that as the car goes round the circuit now, there's a group in Brackley, or a group in Milton Keynes, or a group in Maranello, who are in real time sitting in a dark black room with all the silencing in it. There's no noise in it, and there's a racing car, a Red Bull or a Ferrari or whatever it might be, It's called a 7-post rig, and it was 7. It might be more posts now because we had to have one. And in real time, as every driver drives round every circuit or every corner, the telemetry, there's more than 200 sensors on a car and more than one head on each sensor, that's happening in real time, going through to Brackley or Milton Keynes or Maranello. It's going through with information all on telemetry that they're seeing screens in a quiet room. Sometimes they'll pick it up before they will pick it up at the circuit because of all the noise, the distraction. And suddenly because they're all live on headsets, left-hand rear dampers not good on rebound. It must have a valve problem. This might come from Brackley. Before the guys over here who are being distracted and a lot of noise even think or hear about it in the garage or on the wall, the pit wall. So the technology we have, I think, is beyond anything that I can think of. I think even more than aerospace or the airline industry. Just every second of the race is monitored, regulated, and cleared. So strategy was something, that's the same deal. We were virgins in all of that sort of stuff.
We have one last question for you, and this is obviously a very interesting question around female drivers from Pedro Enrique Lodi from Brazil. He would like to know, what are your thoughts on the best way to get women a seat in F1 following the announcement of the W Series recently?
No problem. The problem is that we don't have enough young girls in go-karts and karting. Go-karts the wrong name, karting. Lewis Hamilton was karting from the age of 8, probably, seriously karting, with his father having 4 jobs to fund his young son getting into being a real competitor and a winner. If there's only 1 or 2 girls against thousands of boys going through karting, how do you possibly expect a girl to be in a Formula One car? It's almost just either a privilege or we've got to do it. It's not because that young lady or that young girl is suddenly the hottest thing in town for driving racing cars. So therefore, we're never going to have it unless we have young families saying the boy and the girl go karting together. But to do that, they need engines all the time, they need tyres all the time, they need fuel all the time. It's a huge budget, even in karting. And at the moment, it's only boys to a very large extent. And because there are women doing it, girls doing it. But I wish we could get it to happen. I wish in my lifetime I will see a female driver in the top 6 in the world, if you like. And think of the cosmetics. Think about the clothing. Think about all of the elements that a woman could provide in a commercial environment that currently doesn't exist. So it would be good for motorsport and Formula One in particular. We've had it in rallying. We've had a couple of very good world champion in rallying we've had as a woman. And Sterling Moss's sister was a very good rally driver. And Mouton was a very good rally driver. So, and Marie-Claude Momon was a very good racing rally driver, but not Formula One. So to get into Formula One, they've got to be doing it from the age of 8, if not before, and really having to get the funding from Tom, Dick and Harry, as well as the family, in order to give that girl a chance. And she's got to go through the karting, through the formative classes of the sport, but every Formula One team would love to have a female driver. It would be a tremendous crowd puller, apart from anything else. And there's no reason at all. It's nothing to do with strength. Power steering, paddle shift. She can have good head and neck muscles like anybody else. And by the way, in my day, a German swimmer or gymnastic female would be stronger and better developed than Jackie Stewart. and I drove a racing car. And in those days, you did the shifting, and you did the gear change, and you did everything else, and you did the whole shebang. But now, a woman could certainly do it, and she could have done it then too, if she had been given the chance. But they're not being given the chance. But that's because of either the parents or the wealth not being included in the package.
So that concludes the questions for today. So Jackie, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much. It's a new dimension for me to do this in such a fashion. So it's very enjoyable.